Hi everyone. The last class we have discussed about the psychological testing, and we have tried to give an introduction towards the paper psychological measurement and testing, and we have also discussed some of the characteristic of psychological testing. And here we are trying to give you the uses of some of the uses of psychological testing, where it is being used and what is the use of this psychological test. And here you can see some of the uses of psychological test. It is being used to detection of specific behavior and used to understand the individual differences and to diagnose by the psychological test. And it is also being used for some of the legal classification, and it is also being used for promoting the self understanding. So psychological tests can be used for these purposes. So when we are discussing with the first use, that is the detection of specific behavior, that is the psychological test is used to measure and to detect the abilities of the person or abilities of the people. So this psychological test can be used to understand the abilities or to measure the abilities of a person and individual differences. That is, this psychological test is used to measure the individual differences. That is, between or difference between the abilities of different persons and the performance of the same person at different situations or different times. That is, to understand the individual differences or to make the comparison for the two different people and for the same person in different situations also. And the third one, that is to diagnose by the psychological test. That is, these tests are psychological tests are usually used in clinical psychology. So in clinical psychology, a test function is to diagnose mental disorders. So tests are used in mental hospitals and coaching and guidance centers for the assessment and diagnosis of mental disorders. So that we already discussed yesterday in the previous class, that it can also be helpful or it is being used in the schools and some other areas to understand the abilities of the students, like mental ability or intelligence test or aptitude test or achievement test, so something like that. And mainly it can be used in the clinical session to understand or to diagnose the disorders. And when moving to, so here we can mention some of the psychological tests can be done within the clinical sessions, like Raven progressive matrices, okay, RPM, or we can use some other test name like MMPI, that is Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. So to understand the personality of the people, some, that is to diagnose the personality of the person, some of the psychological tests are being used in the clinical area. And the other use of psychological testing, that is we can see here, that is a legal classification. So by means of this legal classification, that a psychological test helps in classifying a number of people into different categories. It will understand or it will help us to classify people into different category. That is, for example, that is normal and abnormal. So when conducting a test, that you will understand whether the person is, when conducting the psychological test, you will understand whether he is or she is normal or normal and abnormal. And you can also categorize like criminal and innocent. So when it comes in the case of legal areas, then you will understand whether they are in the criminal area or in the innocent, the person is a criminal or the person is an innocent person. And the other one is, other example, you can see that it has intellectual and mental retarded. So that we already mentioned that in the clinical area, that you will understand the intelligence of the person, or the person is or the person is having any mental retardation. So this can be done, this classification can be done like intellectual and mental retarded, and the other one is able and disabled, etc. So this type of classification, like, it is a legal classification, so this classification can be done by this psychological test, so it can be considered as a uses of psychological test. The another important use of the psychological testing can be include the promoting self understanding. So we can know that from the psychological test, it provides standardized information about the abilities and or capabilities, aptitudes, and potential competencies, interest, trait, and states of a person, which helps in understanding one's own personality, and accordingly he or she can plan for the future uh, perspective. That is, by understanding the persons by himself, though he or she can understand their own potential competencies areas, and they can understand their abilities, and they can understand their capabilities, and these all things can be done, or these all things can be done through a standardized test. That is that is why psychological tests can be used. So this can be understand to the person, or understand to the people, that what are their traits and what are their states of a person, and this, when understanding these all areas, he or she can plan her future, or plan his future in a better manner, or they can understand their own personality. So these this will help, or psychological testing will help to promote the self understanding of the person. The other area of other uses of this psychological testing include scientific inquiry or research. So we can see that some of the experts use psychological testing or test for research purposes, and which provide information about the mental level and personality of the subject, or personality of the client. So, or personality, or mental level of the participant in that research. So to understand, or to uh, provide better information, they will be providing, that is, this psychological test will be providing better information regarding the mental level of the participant or subject, including in the research area. And the other use of psychological tests can be included with military selections. So that we already discussed in the first areas, some of the recruitment can be done. So like, a close related application of psychological testing is to be found in the selection and classification of military people, or military personnels. So we know why it is being done. Psychological testing can be done with the recruitment, or in the classification of military personnels, because uh, the military situation underwent a phenomenal increase during the wars and all. So this psychological test can be done in the classification throughout the military selection. The other use of psychological testing can be done in the area of industries. So we can see that in industry and business, tests are helpful, or psychological tests are helpful in the selection and classifying personals for placement in the job. So as we said in the military selection, in the industrial setting or in the organization setting also, they will be conducting some of the tests and this test will be useful for the industry or the organization to classify the people into the uh, placement of the jobs. Like they'll be selecting from the simpler level or the simpler skilled to the simpler skilled people to the highly skilled people. From the selection of filling some of the clerks and salesperson to the top management for any of the positions. However, the results or the test results are only one source of information. So that is when they are appointing or when they are selecting of the people from the lower level to the higher level, and this test can be done, and it can be managed. This test can be managed to uh, select the person from the selecting the person in each positions. Mainly in the industrial level or in the organization level, the organization psychologist will be working out throughout the stages of placement or to improve the uh, functions or performance of the uh, workers in that situation or in that industries. So organization psychology will be playing a better role in the psychological testing here, or psychologist will be using social organization psychologist will be using some of the psychological testing to understand. So industrial or organization psychology represent many divisions of the American Psychological Association. That is, some common research and practice areas for industrial and organization psychologists may include some of the areas where the we'll mention one some of the areas where psychological testing can be done. The areas like job performance, to understand the job performance, and job analysis, and personal recruitment and selection, for recruiting the people and selecting. The test can be done by the organization psychologist. And performance management or performance appraisal, and to understand individual assessments like skill and ability and testing, etc. And it can be also done for giving some of the training and training evaluation and traveling training development. And it can be also done to understand some of the job attitude and commitment and job commitment and some of the job satisfaction of the employer with the industries. And it can be done, or psychological tests can be also done for understanding the leadership and executive coaching of the workers. And it is also helpful for occupational health and safety to understand, to make them aware of the situations. So this is the area, or this is this these are the useful these are the uses of psychological testing in the industrial level. The other two uses of psychological testing can be done with the education sector as well as in the clinical setting. So we'll be familiar with the education setting, that what are the psychological tests, especially those of general intelligence and specific aptitudes. Test can be done to explain or to understand the educational classification and selection and planning of the students within the grades, different grades. So that is that can be done with the use of psychological testing in the education sector. And the other important area that, and in education setting, the education psychologist will be doing or performing this test term of we'll be calling it as education psychologist or practitioners. And the other important use of this psychological testing, mainly it comes in clinical setting, like rehabilitation centers or mental hospitals. So in clinical or mental hospitals, psychological tests are used primarily for individual diagnosis of factors associated with personal problems of learning, behavior, behavioral attitude or specific interpersonal relationships or interpersonal relations. So to understand the factors which are associated with the uh, problems within the person, and also to understand behavioral attitude of the person that comes to the clinical setting, or the client or the participant or the subject. So for that, some of the psychological testing can be done within the clinical setting or in the mental hospitals. Here we are going to mention some of the properties of a psychological test, or we can say that some of the characteristics of a good test, good psychological test, or how a test should be done. What are the properties we can find out with a good psychological test? So, the psychological test refers to the process of measuring the evaluation of a psychological function. So it is why it is being done, why psychological test has been done to measure or the evaluation of psychological function within the person. So here we can see some of the properties of a psychological test. So the first one is objectivity. So psychological tests tend to be objective, standardized measure standardized measures, and require a highly controlled uniform procedure for administration and scoring. So from this we can understand that the test should be free from subjective, that is judgment regarding the ability and skill, knowledge, trait, or potentiality to be measured and evaluated. So there should be a form of or there should be a uniform procedure for the administration and scoring. So it should not go with subjective in nature. It should be measured and it should be scored in the uh, numerical way. One of the other characteristics of a good test, that is quantitative in nature. So psychological tests remain quantitative measures. Descriptive evaluation is not followed. So we can say that the psychological test can be conducted in the quantitative manner. That is, there are two type of measures we can see, that is quantitative and qualitative. So we will understand or will know that on the basis of quantitative there should be some numbers and scores, and qualitative means it will measure the levels of the test. It should not be done with the numbers, or there should not you should not find out a scoring procedures to be done in the numerical way. So psychological tests always use number and scores to understand the levels per what is the level of that. So one of the example we can see that we are conducting uh, intelligence scores, intelligence based on the scores what we are getting, or it is based on the numbers what we are getting. We will be classifying it into different levels. The other characteristics of a good psychological test is the test should be standardized. A psychological test is a standardized measure always, and standardization implies uniformity of procedure in administrating and scoring a test. So, whatever we are doing with the questionnaires or with the some other tools will be like inventories that we are using for some of the psychological test. Inventory means a group of or a it will be with a different parts, like part A, part B, like that. It is a group of questions, different sectors of question that will describe one variable, like for example emotional intelligence. So it is a cluster of or a part of different areas, different factors all together will be giving the variable called emotional intelligence. So it can be done it in the inventory way, or emotion intelligence scale can be used for understanding emotion intelligence. So there will be standardization should be done with the questionnaires always, or in the test there will be standardization will be done. So it implies implies that uniformity of procedure in administrating and scoring a test. So for a standardized questionnaire or a standardized test, there should be a proper procedure for the administration, and proper scoring key or scoring norms will be presented for analyzing the data, or to come up to the result of the test what we have done. So standardization is an important area in the psychological test, and this standardization will give a standardization will give better nature to the psychological test. So it is a property for being conducting a psychological test. The other characteristics of a good test is practicability. So from that word it is we can understand. So it should be the test should be practicable uh, in time. That is it is required for the completion of that psychological test. So the test must be practicable in time required for the completion, and the length, number of items or questions, and scoring, etc. So it should be the test should be practicable with the number of items or questions. It should not go too lengthy. The questionnaire will not be, or the test will not be too lengthy, and it will make irritation with the participant. And it should be practicable in the case of scoring. That means it will not create too much difficult that means it should not make any difficult in the scoring norms. So it should be practicable in nature. The test should not be too lengthy and difficult to answer as well as scoring. So in these two areas, that is clearly mentioned that it should not go too lengthy, and it should not make much trouble in the area of answering all the answering the scores also. So in the case of analysis, it should not make trouble with the researcher for understanding the scoring norms. And and the other important characteristics of a good psychological test is reliability and validity. So sometimes we'll be very familiar with these two terms. So test should be reliable and valid. It is the most important characteristics of psychological test. So this refers or the reliability refers to the extent to which they obtain results are consistent or reliable. So reliability means it should be whatever the times, or however the times we have how much times we have done the test in a continuous manner, it should go with an consistent result. And when the test is administered on the same sample for more than once with a reasonable gap of time, a reliable test will yield same scores. It means the test is trustworthy. There are many methods of testing reliability of a test. So whatever the times, how different, if we have done the test more than once, if we put some gap between the test also, the scores, or it should yield the same scores whatever the times we have done. So that is called reliability of the test. And when moved to the term of validity, it refers to extent to which the test measures what it intends to measure. For example, if we when an intelligence test is developed to assess the level of intelligence, it should assess the intelligence of the person, not other factors. So validity means if we constructed a test to understand or to assess the level of intelligence, so that test should, or the test must assess the intelligence of the person and not any other variables like emotional intelligence or some other variables in the psychological area. If we develop, or if we constructed that test is to measure the intelligence, it should measure, or it is intended to measure the intelligence itself, not any other psychological variables. So that should be known as validity. So these are some of the characteristics that we can see with the good psychological test.